Hi, and welcome to the 9th CRC Roundtable. I think just because one of our speakers has a hard stop at 1, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm sure other people will be signing on. So welcome again to the 9th CRC Roundtable, a monthly virtual seminar series. Just to remind you, if you haven't been here before, our intention is to host where we match scientific advances and management needs. The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. Each seminar invites a diverse range of research managers and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics. And the purpose is to build connectivity between all of us and to increase our collective competency for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 15 minutes each to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. This is all about us, giving us a place to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future we want. I've begun each of these webinars by answering the question of why this topic at this time by these speakers. So why this topic? The number and scale of stream restoration and buffer projects has grown over the years as state and localities scramble to meet their obligations for restoration. So state and localities, this is an interesting number. Once they anticipated doing 655 miles of stream work by 2025. They are now planning to complete 900 miles by that time at an estimated total cost of $500 million. So it's quite an investment. Why this time? Because we are beginning to have data on the type of returns from that investment. For example, researchers at the UMC's Appalachian Lab reviewed 40 projects for ecological uplifts, but didn't find many ecological benefits. Why these two speakers? Each has a long history of expertise in the two dimensions of a project: the technical aspects of stream restoration and assessing success, and the important human dimension of finding places to do those projects and how to bring people along. How trade-offs are articulated. So let me just give you a brief introduction to our speakers. And both have these wonderfully sort of diverse approaches. Tess Thompson has worked across almost all potential contexts as an engineer in state government, in private consulting, as a consultant to USAID, and as now an academic at Virginia Tech. Her research in watershed management focuses on stream and wetland restoration, urban stream systems, and stream back erosion. She also trains the next generation of practitioners via courses in fluvial geomorphology and stream restoration. And Andy Miller has agreed to be in the audience for color commentary if need be. John Munsell, I think, has a different kind of range of diversity in his background, in that he really works in the agroforestry nexus, which blends a tremendous number of different disciplines and really by necessity has to dissolve those boundaries or those cylinders of excellence, as we've come to love to call them. His work includes private forest and farm stewardship, agroforestry and whole farm planning, bioenergy and family forest sustainability, and collaborative conservation. He also prepares the next generation of practitioners via courses on advanced agroforestry topics. And it sounds like he co-teaches a graduate level human dimensions of natural resources seminar. I also hear that he plays a mean string bass. So each of our panelists have extensive experience, but we've asked them to limit their remarks to a very short time period. And I understand, panelists, that that's a challenge. I'll try to gracefully let you know when you're at the 15-minute mark. If you do have material that you are unable to share because of that time limit, we'll find a way to make your slides or additional remarks available to all attendees. So the most important part of this extended webinar is the opportunity for attendees to be able to ask those brave and clumsy questions. So help me do that. And with that, I will turn over the virtual floor to Tess Thompson.
Thanks, Denise. And thank you for inviting me. I look forward to it. I always like talking about streams and trees and forestry. So with that, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So Denise has asked me to talk about in 15 minutes something that I teach over 2 semesters at the graduate level. So hold on. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, in general, how streams work, quote unquote, and then talk about stream restoration, why we do it, give some examples, and then turn it over to John, and then we can talk more later. So some things that I think it's important to keep in mind when you talk about stream systems is how long is a long time is a matter of perspective. As there's a joke out there that to an American, 100 years is a long time, and to an Englishman, 100 miles is a long time. And so on the right is a diagram basically of the Earth history. And at the very top, and you can almost see the tiny little bump there, that's Homo sapiens, okay? Streams are basically geological features, and our lifespans, and certainly engineering design and say land use planning, are just a mere tiny speck compared to the life of a stream. So that's something I think is important to keep in mind. You could also say the same with respect to human life and trees. They far outlive us. Okay, so streams, what do they do? I think about streams as having 3 basic jobs. And the first one is pretty self-explanatory. They transport water. Okay, no kidding, right? The second one is they transport sediment. And sediment's one of those words that what it means to you depends on your academic or your educational work background. Coming from the water quality standpoint, I always thought of sediment as bad, similar to what you see on the right, where there's a plume of fine sediment coming from some construction on the Virginia Tech campus. But in reality, streams move sediment to a geologist can range from the fine soils you see in the water there up to boulders. And in fact, if streams didn't move sediment, okay, the Appalachian Mountains, which is where I am, would look like the Rockies, which is what they looked like millions of years ago. And those of you in the coastal plain would be sitting in the ocean. And so over these long periods of time, there's erosion in high areas, such as the Appalachians. The streams transport that sediment and deposit it in the coastal plain. Okay, and so that is a very natural process, and sediment in streams is actually normal. And so to give you some examples, of course, being in the eastern US, which is a very old landscape, very weathered, we don't realize this as much. But if you were out at Mount Rainier and the national park there, you would see something like this, which is the Nisqually. So this is downstream from a glacier on Mount Rainier. And all of this sediment is coarse sediment, it's bedload, and it's moving, and it's supposed to be there. So not all sediment is bad. So time is really long depending on your perspective, and not all sediment is bad. Okay, so point 3 is streams support aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so it's important that they provide cover from overhanging banks, moderate the environment. So there's, particularly in the eastern US, that they're shaded. They transport and cycle food, typically in the form of leaves from trees, and they also transport and cycle nutrients. And so these are the 3 things that I think about in terms of what a stream should be doing. Okay, we looked at that. The other thing to think about is that streams are incredibly complex. Whoops, we'll get to that. I'm gonna hide that. Okay, there we go. And so this is a diagram from a textbook by Roy Charlton. And here's our stream. I don't know if you can see my arrow, the floodplain and channel system. And there are a lot of things that affect that. So base level at the bottom is 1. So that's sea level. What is 0.0? Okay. Tectonics, the plates are still moving, things are rising, things are falling. That's still going on, which affects topography and geology. Climate, obviously, the weather patterns currently, and human activity. And so all of these things are changing constantly. And of course, both base level, i.e. sea level, and climate are changing much more rapidly these days due to human activity. And so streams are constantly adjusting to all of these factors. Okay. And that's just from a physical standpoint. Okay, because of this complexity, okay, because everything is changing, the idea of stream restoration, that term is a misnomer. Okay, we're not going to restore, except in very rare cases, a stream back to a given state. Okay, and so first of all, the question is, well, which time period? And in reality, particularly with climate change, we're just not going back. Okay, so really the question more then is, what do we want to achieve with stream restoration? Okay. Oh, and before I get to that though, just some of the impacts, and the Eastern US has had a number of impacts. So when European colonists arrived, of course, one of the first things they did was clear out all the beaver. They did make it, but just barely. And then we cleared out all the trees, frequently building railroads up the stream channel, okay, to haul the trees out. We cleared the land. And then, of course, given the type of really strong convective storms we have in the summer, the land eroded. And you can still see these gullies on the landscape. You can still see what's called a corduroy road. See all these trees in the railroad tracks. Those are still out there. You can find them. We also installed mills to mill the lumber and our crops. Okay, and so a lot of those ponds filled in with sediment. Even where we didn't have mills, that sediment smothered the floodplains. Okay, and we refer to that as legacy sediment. So this is Tom's Creek outside of Blacksburg. You can see this nice dark line here. That is the old floodplain surface, and there's some good 2 feet of fine-grained sediment sitting on top of it. Okay, and not only has the floodplain been smothered, but because of upstream urbanization, the stream channel has eroded downward. Okay, so whoops, wrong direction. So we have all this fine-grained sediment sitting in the floodplains, and then we urbanized the watershed. So we paved it over, increased the flow rate and the volume of water running off the land surface. And now this is what our urban streams look like. This is it's an unnamed tributary. It's so small, to Mud Lick in Roanoke, Virginia. And just to point some things out, here in the western part of Virginia, we're actually lucky that we have bedrock in the landscape. And so the streams will only erode down so far. I'll show you some pictures of other places. But this is a small stream that you could walk across. You can see that the channel has dramatically cut down and has widened. Okay, so this bunch of trees didn't actually grow there. It kind of fell there. And I'm sure that the stormwater pipe was not installed this way. Okay, so that's the level of channel erosion that is going on. Okay, so lots of human impacts. Okay, and these are just some other pictures. This is from Anne Arundel County. These are places where there's not, the bedrock's a little bit lower and it won't stop the erosion. So in the coastal plain, this is Anne Arundel County. You can see how high those banks are. This is Mike Rolband with WSSI out of Gainesville. So this is Snake Den Branch. You'll look at another picture of that. Here is that dark soil. That's the original stream or the floodplain. This line of rocks is the original stream bed. And so the original stream is in the middle of this bank. Above it is the sediment that was eroded after European colonization. And this is bedrock and some saprolite. This is what was under the stream originally, and it has downcut.
Tess, you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to hurry on. So what's stream restoration? And I'm going to show a number of slides from Andy Miller. Thank you, Andy. So an intervention or modification of the stream channel or riparian zone. Okay, it might include the stream channel or the bed material in the vegetation community. So common practices, raising the bed, of course, because they're so deep now, or lowering the floodplain surface. So regrading the channel banks to a gentler slope, planting vegetation, installing structures, or going in and completely reconfiguring the channel. And there are multiple design approach, which I call camps, which we won't go into the great detail of that. Okay, so why do we do stream restoration? One, to fix watershed scale problems. Potentially, some of those scale problems are actually due to local issues, but water quality impairments, TMDLs, of course, local stormwater permits, which are called MS4s. A lot of times the requirements in those permits are related to TMDLs, and also comprehensive watershed management plans. So a lot of municipalities participate in programs that FEMA has to deal with flooding, and it involves developing these watershed management plans. Very commonly, we undertake stream restoration to fix reach scale problems. So there's infrastructure or property that's being damaged, or we might be interested in encouraging a particular species, such as trout. So because of habitat degradation, we'll do stream restoration. And so this can be stabilizing the banks. We talked about this. So some of the goals, I don't have the correct title. So the goal may be to stabilize the banks, stop migration, reconnect the stream channel to the floodplain, so make sure that the stream does flood. That's actually a good thing. We may want to slow the water down, or rehabilitate the stream, say for trout populations or a particular species. Okay, and this is done with the goal, and Denise said it, of this idea of functional uplift. And the idea is ultimately our goal is to improve the ecology of the stream. To do that, there are a number of things we have to fix first. And this is a diagram from Will Harmon. I think it does a great job of illustrating this concept. You have your geology and your climate. First of all is, how do we work with our hydrology? The water, when it runs off, how frequently, hydraulics, then getting into what's the velocity in the stream channel, how much flow in the stream before it goes onto the floodplain, which is a good thing. Geomorphology, are we seeing the types of forms in the stream? Are we transporting that coarse sediment? Is there wood? Is there a diversity of physical form in there? And then physiochemical, anywhere from pollutants to pH to temperature. And all of that is really the foundation for the biology. Okay, so some examples of stream restoration very quickly. This is from Solange Filoso from UMCES. So this is a gully, and this would be an RSC, regenerative stormwater conveyance, to stabilize that channel. This is a similar thing, so in the coastal plain, and making it more of a wetland system. I'm going to kind of breeze through these. These were all from a panel at the Chesapeake Modeling Symposium this past summer. This is from Dave Gorman. So this is what we call a valley restoration, where you had severe erosion and they lowered the entire floodplain surface. This is from Land Studies. So again, this was removing that legacy sediment, lowering the bank height, meandering the channel. Oh, this is the stream lab at Virginia Tech. So this is down, even though it's a rural setting here, upstream it's 80% urbanization. And so cattle had access to it. And we just regraded the stream banks and planted them. We did create some small floodplains downstream. And you can see the vegetation growing and there. And of course, the trees are even bigger now. So that's another approach. I always say that my preferred design approach for stream restoration is basic engineering design. And what I mean by that is you start off, what's the need? And so, for example, improving water quality. Well, what's the problem with the water quality? Okay, well, we're having excessive channel erosion, which is adding sediment nutrients. What are the different solutions? But you also have to consider design constraints. So you maybe need to protect infrastructure. If you're in an urban environment, there are certain things you can't change, such as pipes under roads, pipelines, bedrock. There are permit requirements. And then design criteria. Of course, everybody wants to minimize cost and a lot of times minimize tree removal. Okay, but that's going to change the design. And so any type of constraint or limitation like that is going to affect our functional lift and what we can achieve. And so sometimes in stream restoration, we have to compromise. Actually, not sometimes, mostly in stream restoration, we have to compromise. And what I mean by that is this is an example of a channel that's basically been hardened. Okay, but that's because it's actually Howard County, Maryland. You have townhouses. This is a very confined valley, very steep slope through here, and they created step pools. Okay, certainly it's not the most ideal solution. This channel isn't going to move ever, but that's one of the goals of the project. We may not get as much of the biology returning as we would like, but there are a lot of constraints here. And like I said, stream restoration in urban watersheds requires compromise. So this is Snake Den Branch, where you saw that was really incised. This was in a park, but the homeowners association really made it clear that they wanted the minimum number of trees taken down. And so what that required was keeping the stream at a pretty high slope, which also then required putting in some big rocks.
Tess, there you go. Okay.
Right.
Thanks. Yeah, and we'll leave the questions to the end. So thank you very much. And that ending point is, I think, a good segue. So I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you, Denise. Hello, everybody. Let me just do the standard here and share my screen. So give me a quick second. Do you see my intro slide? Yeah.
Yes,
nice, expansive farmscape from a drone. Yeah, my name is John Munsell, introduced. Thank you very much, Denise, for providing that introduction. And I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, but it's all kind of related. It's in, this kind of larger universe of issues in terms of stream restoration, water quality, land use applications, those types of things. And I like that, Tess was covering and, explicitly noting the kind of dynamic nature of the biophysical attributes in terms of streams and how that relates to particular actions to mitigate problems or to kind of facilitate some of the positive benefits that are observed. And I'm going to, follow up and focus in on adoption and retention. So shifting gears and thinking in terms of the kind of the human system that accompanies, some of the particular technical strategies that are out there at our disposal in terms of managing these waterways. And that by necessity requires addressing the kind of complexity and diversity within, the segment of our society that, has the responsibility for stewarding or owning these waterways. And what that then leads to is this intersection of some of the complexities that Tess mentioned and the complexities within our social systems. And that creates kind of a disproportionality across the landscape, which adds some complexity to the idea of advancing the use of some of these technologies, but it also has some strengths to it as well. If you kind of think about it in a constructed way that has some variability, but also some kind of meaning and definition. And that's where I'll touch on structural and functional design considerations, and not so much in terms of like what you might look up in your technical manual, but thinking about how people think about these spaces to begin with, and how we can match some of the technicalities with, quite a diverse array of values and perspectives on land uses. And, back to the insights and ideas, I want to say that these are, John Munsell based, and what I've gleaned. There are obviously many other ideas and things. It's not exhaustive, but one I want to put forward is this framework of agroforestry, and talk a little bit about some of the adoption research that, I've participated in to provide some insights in terms of what people are thinking about and how they respond and how their differences relate to, the potential application or existing applications on the landscape, and then transition into focusing on programs and possibilities to conclude. So let's start this way. I think I've already kind of alluded to it, that we fall trapped to describing the landowner or the land steward in a very singular sense. And that's just not correct. We should not do that. I mean, they are not a monolith. There's a great deal of diversity in this sector, those that steward and own these resources. And so we have to think about that complexity and how do we kind of create strategies for communication, for extension outreach, for technical support that matches appropriately to that diversity. Indeed, the reflection across the landowning base and land stewardship base is what you might find in the public writ large. So we need to keep that in mind, because they're not only just diverse, but another factor to consider is that it's dynamic. Just like the stream channel and bank is dynamic in terms of its process over time, we have a lot of change within the landowning and land stewardship base. One in particular to note is that we're in the midst of the largest intergenerational transfer of land that this country has ever seen. So there is a lot of land changing hands between families. We also have new ownership coming on, for different reasons, such as investments. So, that thing is moving, that kind of base of ownership and stewardship just changing all the time. As an example, within the forestry sector, we see that the average tenure is pretty short, around 7 years. So, when we think about these long-term projects and we think about putting perennial on the landscape, and, I know as a forester, trees grow slowly. My ag colleagues like to joke sometimes that we get to sit under the tree and philosophize while they're thinking about 2 and 3 rotations annually. So that's an important consideration. Now, typically what we do is we kind of think in terms of the classic diffusion curve when it comes to adoption and land technologies, land use technologies. And we think about that over time. And it's helpful. It gives us a good idea of the overall trajectory. Like, what percentage of potential adopters have actually adopted? Are they we're just looking at the innovators or the early adopters? And that occurs over time. But, if you really want to kind of dig in and think about this complexity relative to that curve, that standard distribution, we need to know who are these people, in the innovator class or the early adopter class, and why are they there? I mean, that's an important question. Maybe, inherently they are more innovative or more prone to adopt, but there's all kinds of contextual factors that are going to affect whether they actually take steps or not. And in addition to that, once someone has adopted a technology, we also need to ask the question, what if this person discontinues? And why did that happen? Why did they abandon the technology? So these are important things that are kind of like contextual and undergird this diffusion and adoption process. And we take a look at where we are with respect to some of the goals and trajectories in the Bay watershed. Look at the red dot. We're kind of down there in the low end. And I think we're at a stage where things have kind of stagnated and there's some head scratching and questioning about how do we move forward, So that's where we can kind of take a look at some of the social and psychological factors that drive decision-making so that we can move from a situation like this, which is at the Catawba Farm just outside of Roanoke, to something like this, which is 8 years hence, the same creek. That's the Catawba Creek, headwaters of the Chesapeake Bay. How do we get there? Well, we like to promote systems that have both an underlying common structural pattern. So that's something that you might look up. It's codified. You can see it. Everybody can kind of make sense of it. But we also have to understand that system also has to have a great deal of functional latitude, because if we're going to match to particular diverse objectives and perspectives within that, we need to have that kind of wiggle room. And that leads to a framework that's based on positive feedback, not negative feedback. So it's not like you can't do this and you can only do this. It's more like, okay, within this framework, what can you do? And that's where agroforestry comes in, because we don't want to think about just putting people in a particular box, but giving them the multifunctional tools to springboard into something that resonates much more specifically with their own contextual needs in terms of how they might manage a waterway or upslope runoff, using perennial or other types of technologies. And I love the quote, if you can't do one thing, you can always do something else. That is how we should be promoting these systems. And it's not just what and how, but also why. Those are important questions. So I'm going to touch on the agroforestry approach quickly, dive into some adoption research. It's just going to be cursory. Talked about diverse and stacked benefits and then novel markets and performance. So agroforestry, quickly defined, it's intentional, and it's the combination of trees and or crops and livestock in the same space. It's not, the forest is here, the pasture's here, the crops are there. Oh, it's all in one parcel. No, it's all together. And it mimics an ecosystem, so it's dynamic. And you can realize some pretty important benefits, both in terms of production, but also conservation, because you have that perennial component in the system. So yeah, it's taking our forest management knowledge and pushing that into the agricultural space. And it's pulling our agricultural proposition into the woodlands. So we are basically blending our land use and production. And by doing that, we can enhance overall output of food and fiber while also protecting water quality, sequestering carbon, and providing biodiverse habitats and a whole host of other benefits. And we can just see here example, the Catawba Farm right there. That Catawba Creek you can see is bounded by that existing forest infrastructure, but we have a floral buffer that's just outside of that, leading into annual production. Cold season broccoli, heritage variety of maize, we had chili peppers we're growing there. So we're practicing that ag, but we've got it nice and buffered and it's all blended together. It's a far cry from this, which in many ways, in the binary sense, this is how the kind of conservation model works, right? It's like put trees on the landscape, cover it, carpet it. So here we see our pine trees covering the landscape. Well, what do we lose? We lose a whole host of other uses and values in that system. One, you could actually grow food there potentially, but not in this setting, right? The pine crop is taking up all the resources. But two, you have a whole host of other values and benefits associated with that land that are kind of wedged into a monoproduction system. And that's where we come to some disproportionality too. How that kind of approach cuts across the land doesn't make a lot of sense if it's uniform. You have to think about the diverse array of design strategies, because each parcel, each step you take on a landscape, the threat differs. And so we have to be responsive in a ratio way relative to those challenges. And then we have to couple that with the fact that we have a diverse array of stewards out there taking care of these landscapes and potentially becoming involved with some of these strategies. So that gets me to some of the research. This paper was published in the journal Soil and Water Conservation, did it with a graduate student, and we surveyed some landowners in Smith Creek, North Fork of the Shenandoah, Catawba Creek, and Lower Reed Creek, in all kind of the western side of Virginia. And we asked them about how they use their land, and we broke them into different groups, different types. And then we started propositioning, interest in particular land uses that have this kind of blended approach, conservation, production. And what we found is that, the new owners were most inclined toward these types of practices. And going back to the intergenerational transfer, let's keep that in mind. They had the smallest acreage, however, but not a small portion of the overall acreage. So substantial footprint, but they tended to own smaller parcels, which makes sense. They're not intensive in terms of land use. And they had a mixture of amenity and production values. Now, the conventional producers were least inclined, right? They had the largest acreage, which makes sense, as they are actually carrying out agricultural operations, but they were not adamantly opposed. They just needed to be framed in a different way for them. So that's an important finding. It's not like, oh, new owners versus conventional producers, one or the other. Both can come along. It's just varying the message and the benefits. With respect to those that have already adopted, no, actually, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. This is another study. We looked at some potential interest in agroforestry, riparian buffers explicitly. Now, the take-home message here was that risk was the big factor in terms of if somebody saw a lot of risk in it, they weren't going to do it. And I think a lot of that risk relates to the fact that there's a time lag in terms of getting benefits from your shrubs and trees. You put them in the ground, you're happy, we did it, the project's done. And then you come back next year and you're like, okay, well, some have died and those look sickly and they're growing a little bit. So there's this time lag, and risk is a big part of it. But performance expectancy was also critical in terms of their interest and social influence. So they're talking to people. There are cultural factors at play here. Now, the newer owners were less involved with production, but more attuned to the multiple objectives. So we see a common theme there in terms of some of the new owners, although they're not necessarily always involved in agriculture, although some are. And then lastly, here we actually surveyed the landowners that have already participating in a conservation program with a riparian buffer in place. We wanted to know about their experience. And what we found was kind of a key result. It's based on the onus of management, not conservation perception, excuse me. Some said, I don't think this is doing much for water quality or stream bank stabilization, but it's not real hard for me to manage. So it's okay, we'll keep it. those that said, hey, I think this is doing great by, water quality objectives, but it is a bear to maintain. I think I'm going to get rid of it. So, the perspective is on how do we support folks to maintain a kind of easier situation with respect to management. But one thing I'd also know is a stark lack of diversity in our conservation programs. And that's something I think that needs to be changed in the future. And some of that is laid out in the paper. So a message of conservation will not work alone is one of the take-home points. For some, a clear and compelling pathway with diverse benefits makes a lot of sense. And I see that with some of the younger generation that's out there taking stewardship and control of some of these landscapes. The concept of sustainability is not foreign to them. And they're thinking creatively, and they want to be kind of a positive attribute in terms of addressing some of our problems while also growing food and fiber. And others are not philosophically opposed. They're just uncertain or singular in thought. So the nature of how you communicate and the benefits and the structural systems that support them might need to be a little bit different than, say, some of the other audiences which have more of a diverse palette. And risk is an important consideration across the board, and time is chief. And so that's where this kind of key question comes in with respect to, what I dabble in, which is the agroforestry world. How do we find ways to have a return on investment in a shorter period of time while we're waiting for some of those longer term benefits associated with our, slower growing perennial species? And so you have this space and time issue. And here we can see now, this is a silvopasture planted, but that's taking space out of the pasture land. We've got oak trees flanked by pine in a kind of trainer tree system. But if you're a producer, it's like, hey, that's a whole corridor where I could graze some of my livestock, and it's gone. And you can promote the conventional approach. Let's make sure you have trees that grow, fruit or nuts or floral crops, but you still have to wait on that. Even if you look at mulberry, you're looking at 3 or 4 years, and that's a very fast growing before you really get a crop. Look at some of these others. Persimmon, you're 8, 9, 10 years before you see anything. So, there's that time lag. And that's where the question of stacking benefits comes into play, like phosphorus and nitrogen and ecosystem services markets. Is there a way to address that early lag by rewarding this kind of transition into a blended system and having species selection that will also provide conventional crops down the road, but early on you get that benefit? And carbon is another. So there was a project I was involved in. I see Jeff Corbin's on this webinar, CCAP, and we focused on how to avoid retirement of multiple objectives while still getting some of the conservation benefits associated with integrating trees into the landscape. One of the interesting results we found in that project was it's not a linear relationship, meaning that for every tree you plant, you get one little increment more of some kind of conservation benefit when it comes to using some of the modeling tools. It's curvilinear, meaning that at lower densities, now recall that pine plantation you saw just carpeting, at lower densities, you get a spike in terms of some of the benefits related to integrating those trees, but you're not retiring agriculture in an agroforestry setting because you're planting them strategically and allowing for annual production to occur in other places. So that was kind of a key finding in that result. And one of the other things that came out of it was modeled versus performance-based systems. As it stands with Virginia's nutrient credit trading program, as far as I know to date, you model it and you calculate your credits. And if you go through with the project and convert, those credits can be made available for you to trade or use in other forms and fashions. Performance-based system might say, okay, that's the modeled output. We can get you started, but you need to monitor. You may actually exceed the amount that the model tells you, and that would reward you with greater credits. So there's some discussion about performance versus model-based systems.
John, can I get you to finish up so people have time to ask questions?
Absolutely. I'm finishing right now. Just want to say that Virginia is one of the leading states in terms of agroforestry applications. It is the leading state when it comes to its area within the Chesapeake Bay watershed in terms of some of these practices. So many thanks. Sorry if I went over a little bit. Yep. Okay.
No, that's okay. We were behind all along, and so you were perfect. I'm waiting to see some questions in the chat, but let me ask one. I think that Tess pointed out, when she made the point about, some watershed problems, but an individual section of stream, right? So there is something that in the collective of actions to be done in a watershed, we are looking for a certain result. And you are talking about allowing a diversity of approaches among land stewards and different sections of the stream. How do you ensure, how do you achieve a balance between allowing that diversity to occur for individual landowners, but ensuring that the collective is meeting some sort of collective goal?
Is that a question for me?
I think for both of you,
I
but
heard
yeah,
landowners
if you want to start.
Yeah. Sure. I don't know, Tess. I mean, if you can speak to some of the technicalities. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at with the structural and functional side of things, is that species selection is a big part of it. And, I mean, the convention is to plant, and I do believe on the creek banks, when you're talking about some of that immediate and proximal stabilization, you need to have, trees with wet feet, so to speak. Sycamore and willow, and they grow well in those kind of wet settings. But as you extend out from those areas, you can integrate our fruit and nut trees and other types of production systems to include also what might grow underneath those canopies for food and fiber production, such as mushrooms and shade obligate settings. So I think that, it's kind of that lens of thinking about using that space in a way that adds value to it, as opposed to just renting it and like a landowner saying, okay, you rented this, you can have it, go plant a monocrop of willow, and we'll walk away. And when my rental program's done, I'm leaving. But, a greater deal of investment. That has been challenging, to kind of promote. I think some have. There's a good example of goat farmers. They produce goat cheese. They planted persimmon along their creek bank. They've integrated that persimmon crop into a line of goat cheese. That's cool. Do we see that happening a lot? No. I think that's where maybe some of the time lag comes into play, and the challenges of supporting people who are hesitant because they see, the effort expectancy is pretty steep here, and the risk involved with taking up those areas. So how do we minimize some of that risk is an important part.
Tess, do you have anything to add to that?
I think John, made some really good points about risk and working with people and the idea of time. And I think that's one of the big challenges dealing with stream systems, dealing with anything like trees that you're trying to get growing, is just the human and planning timescales are really much shorter. And we have to think long-term and accept the fact that there's going to be a lag and some delay.
Tess, you have a question that just came in. Can you briefly explain the different camps in stream restoration methodology?
Sure. So there are different. So when I spoke about, the engineering design, at some point you have to say, what's the cross section? What does the shape of the channel look like? And there are multiple different ways to get to that. I believe in using all the information you can, because it's such a diverse, complex system, and then looking for some coalescence. But there are certain design techniques. So one is, of the oldest, is natural channel design, where you find a reference and you use that as kind of a model for your stream channel. There's some problems with that because, of course, climate is changing and the streams are adjusting. Anyway, they all have problems. In Pennsylvania, valley restoration is very popular, which in a sense, just you remove the historic sediment and you let the stream kind of, the stream is more multi-thread. There's not a single particular channel. In some places, they've used what's called RSC, regenerative stream conveyance, where you, and this is more in the coastal plain, where the channels have been really incised, and you turn the single thread or single channel into like a chain of pools. And so those are all different types of approaches. I believe in using all the approaches you have and to come up with your numbers. rather than just believing that one approach is right. And also realizing it is very place-based, just in terms of what type of channel you would expect there, what are your design constraints? Kind of like John. John, if you have to add to that, your picture with that farm reminded me of that.
Yeah, because I don't feel like I totally answered Denise's question early, but I kind of went off on a tangent. But I mean, I think that what the technicalities you're discussing, I mean, those aren't things just because we have, diverse landowning, land stewardship base that we're going to throw out and just say, hey, you take the pen and paper and go sketch this up and make something cool with, we still want that technical support and consideration. It's just, how do you get to that point where that's actually happening, and so that's where we have to kind of work through some of the facets that are complex and diverse in the social sector, to get to a point where some of that expertise can, play out in any given situation, in any given context, which is going to be always unique. But can we bring a framing to it that's compelling for people, so they see some value in this and they see some investment and the risk is reduced. I think those are important things, because that's what will then lead to, I put the red dot right there at, like, I don't even know if it's 2.5% or whatever, but do you want to get to that tipping point? If you want to get to that tipping point, it's got to make a lot of sense to a lot of people, and that's going to require diversity. But I also think you have to have that structural kind of consistency. So agroforestry as a model can play that. Other conservation programs, if they, have that umbrella approach with some flexibility, can do that. I think, like, we had conversation several years ago, a project coming out of Southwest Virginia with some agency folks, and they loved the idea of a multifunctional riparian buffer. And we had a great conversation, and this is how it ended. Well, to change the standard, that's gonna take a long time, So there's some policy and bureaucracy issues at play too, in terms of some of our support systems. So it was just additional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, John. That helped a lot. There's a question from Norm O'Foran. Is there, or what sort of instrumentation or monitoring is in place to check progress in water quality, both immediately and over the long timeframes being discussed? Is it adequate or needs improvement? What capabilities exist? And I think this speaks to both of you have mentioned this issue of a time lag, right? And setting reasonable expectations, and how do we talk about that? So I don't know if Tess, you want to go first, and then John, about answering that question.
Sure. So there is water quality monitoring going on now in every state. That's required actually by the Clean Water Act. And so there's ambient monitoring that the states conduct. There are a number of U.S. Geological Survey stations, but it is extremely expensive for the USGS to operate. And with streams, at least, the problem is that you need not only the chemistry, and the biology. So we do bug sampling, fish sampling, periphyton, which is the slimy stuff. So all of that sampling. But the problem is it's really expensive to do that. And so we can only do it in limited places.
I think Norm might be talking about, and Norm, correct me if I'm wrong, but more specifically in conjunction with restoration projects.
Oh, okay. So restoration projects are typically, not all of them are monitored at all. And it depends on the state and the Corps, what their requirements are. And typically if they're just a standard restoration project, it's 3 years of monitoring. If it's a mitigation bank, the monitoring is 10 years, and rarely it's water quality. And the reason for that is, unless you are at the very headwaters of the stream, you cannot control water quality. And so, 1,000-foot reach of stream, you're not going to see a change in water quality because of that stream restoration, because our instruments aren't that sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll follow up and note that I mentioned that CCAP project, the Conservation Credit for Agroforestry Production. One thing we looked at, and it was all exploratory, but the results did generally match kind of some of the modeling. There are these well systems. They're small, and there are companies out there trying to, develop this technology that can be deposited on a landscape to help, kind of like a soil sample, where you would, grab a sample periodically out of this well. It's got some filtering in it, does surface, subsurface, and aggregation. You can then send that off. We were looking at that just in an exploratory sense relative to like performance, tracking. But, Tess is talking at more of the landscape scale, and it's true. I mean, the smaller streams and the headwaters and stuff is where you really have the greatest impact. I mean, if you get down into fourth order, fifth order streams, forget it. You can't do anything. But, in some of these sensitive areas where you do have these small little tributaries and things moving through these agricultural spaces, the long-term idea is potentially to have inexpensive monitoring wells on there that would relate to some form of payment in terms of the benefits being provided by producers. And if you're falling behind, just like in any business, if your business is faltering, you better take some mitigative action to improve that if you want to stay in business. And so those that want to get in the ecosystem services markets potentially could use some of these technologies as a way to benchmark and then track impacts over time with respect to their conservation activities. So, and that would not be terribly expensive. Now that's just at the parcel scale. So then that's kind of how I think, or, when I'm working with stakeholders, I typically think of like, okay, that's a land unit here. That's, bounded here. One person controls this, one person controls that. But Tess is talking more about the mosaic. But at that scale, I mean, I think people are thinking about how to try and get some of that instrumentation in there, kind of basic and rudimentary, but also has some teeth to it. So.
Let me ask, and I'm sure this is a substantive question from Andy Miller. And I think you're both going to have wonderful, be able to address this. Andy says, one of the key issues with any of these mitigation strategies is how we prioritize choices, whether it's better to implement projects upstream versus downstream, whether we focus on trying to use the stream to mitigate upstream sources of disturbance versus focusing on keeping water, nutrient, and sediment on the landscape. There's also the question of whether the TMDL creates incentives that cause investments to be made to gain credit and meet requirements that may or may not be the choices you would make to maximize long-term benefits at the local watershed scale. It's a wonderful question. So John, you want to go first in addressing that one?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the whole concept of disproportionality, I was flying through my presentation, but I mentioned ratio approaches. And that's where, and I talked about, if you take one step, and move over, there's a completely different kind of dynamic in that particular portion of that property. Well, a lot of what I've seen that kind of makes me scratch my head is that, this disproportionality across the landscape. You have two parcels side by side that have the same acreage. So let's just say all things being equal, except for one has, a deep draw with like highly erodible soils. The other is rocky, that you take a hurricane to blow off any of the soil and have that run down into the stream. But in ways, because we scale up and we have to manage, this kind of landscape level approach, there's not a lot of distinction between those two parcels. So they kind of generate the same potential in the system, when in fact, we know where the threat is. And so there's a system called the Ag Buffer Builder that it's a kind of basic model, but it looks at universal soil loss equations, and it looks at, topography and soil types and other kinds of factors, and it will give you variable design. And it kind of shows you where your threat areas are and other areas where you may not need to invest in some type of conversion because you're just not going to get an efficiency out of doing that. So that has some financial implications, some management implications, also too, like targeted implications in terms of, addressing the threat. But I do agree, yeah, that disproportionality should be at greater play. It just adds such level of complexity because you need to ratio your credits and say like that one parcel, the 10 acre, even though it's side by side, does not have the same effect as this other one does in all things being equal in a precipitation event or other type of event. So I think that's a great question and one that needs to be looked at, because then you can start to prioritize and target a little bit more specifically and maybe even further incentivize those that have those threat areas to work on addressing the problem.
Tess, would you like to address that?
Sorry.
And I just, let me restate the end of it, just to, whether the TMDL creates incentives that cause investments to be made to gain credits and meet requirements that may or may not be the choice you would make to maximize long-term benefits at the local watershed scale.
Right. So I think what kind of Andy's getting at too is in terms of cost benefit, and in the Bay watershed, and there's a great push, really an immediacy to do something to work on the Bay, but that also, you know, municipalities are trying to get credit to meet the TMDL, and also be good budget minders for the public. And so they're looking for the cheapest way to get credit. And right now that's stream restoration. And that's really what's driving a lot of the stream restoration. And I think there's definitely a question between, well, does it make more sense to work higher up in the watershed versus, say, try to fix the streams when you still have the stormwater problem? Really, we need to be doing both. Stream restoration is not going to be the panacea for water quality, but once you've damaged the streams, just going back and addressing the hydrology, you're not going to fix these incised channels, okay, by just reducing the flows. So you really need to do both.
I did want to get an opportunity, and I know, John, you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. We have a couple minutes left. If you wanted the opportunity to highlight, you know, the one thing you'd like, one or two things you might like people to sort of walk away with from both your comments, your formal comments, and the answers to the question. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to do that. And John, I'll let you go first because I know you have to run.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks again, everyone, for the opportunity. I feel like a take-home message for me is that, you know, we need to think about these systems simultaneously. And, you know, there's a lot of effort that goes into creating, you know, the management approaches, the technical aspects. I mean, tons of, obviously, you know, a legacy of research going into understanding how the stream ecology and stream banks work, and how we can address some of the problems. But we also need to keep our eye on those that will actually use some of these technologies, and those things need to come together. And it's not monolithic, it's diverse. And I think that we can manage our landscapes in ways that match that diversity and that are complementary to the applications of the technologies that are on our hands. And so I think that that's important. I wish sometimes our agencies and others could move a little bit more quickly. I understand the bureaucracy, but at any rate, do not forget about the human dimension. It is all critical to seeing these things through, so we can create the best technologies, but that won't be on the landscape if we don't have people side by side moving forward. So thanks for the time. I appreciate it. Denise, great to meet you. Good to see you, Tess. Take care.
Okay. Tess, your take-home message, what would you like people to walk away with?
Oh, gosh. Well, and I'm seeing Jason Hubbard's question here too as well, but shoot, takeaway would be that stream restoration, there's a time and a place for stream restoration. There are definitely benefits wherever you have really incised channels. It's almost, you won't achieve a lot of your water quality goals if you do not first address the channel incision in these urban areas. But it's not a panacea, and we also need to work up in the watershed as well. Wow. And I think, John, getting to Jason's question about monitoring, I think more monitoring would be awesome. Fund the USGS. There's my pitch for the USGS. However, time is an issue. And what I mean is that stream systems, hydrology, all of this operates on really long time scales. And so we have to monitor a really long time to fully understand the systems. And I think it's the people, as John put it, that is they're part of the system, and we're not used to waiting a long time for answers.
Oh, excellent point. I just want to remind everybody our next CRC Roundtable is June 16th. The topic will be tribal partnerships, and there's a lot of wonderful stories to be told. I thank our speakers again, and we will forward the questions. For example, Jason, your question, we will forward to the speakers, and when we send out the link to the recording, we'll also send out some additional answers to that question. So thank you all, and we hope to see you back on June 16th.